Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be discussing a topic that has been requested multiple times, and that is how to set up a table for competitive play with terrain. This video is extremely subjective since many people have different opinions on how a board should be set up to help balance the game out, but I will give you my opinion on how to properly use terrain to ensure you play a balanced game of Warhammer 40k. To start off, let me start by talking about why this matters and why terrain is a huge part of Warhammer 40k, at least in 8th edition. In this edition, snap firing isn't a thing anymore, and instead of hitting on 6s when you move for certain weapons and vehicles, now it's only a -1 to hit with heavy weapons if you move, which means it's a lot easier to get yourself into a position to deal damage starting from turn 1 with your big guns. In previous editions, it would take multiple turns to set up before you could reliably do damage with your heavy weapons, or really any weapons on tanks, if it didn't have the power of the machine spirit rule. But now it's much easier to get to where you need to be while still putting out damage. This change, combined with the way AP works now in 8th, is the main reason why stuff dies so much faster in this edition compared to previous editions. The game really amped up in pace. So now more than ever, terrain is really important, especially line of sight blocking terrain, because it's easy for almost any army to move up and destroy the enemy army in 1 or 2 turns. So line of sight blocking terrain at least helps each player tactically hide some units in order to either get them into close combat or to just save them for when they are needed so they can be used before they die. If you think about it, if all terrain was removed from the table, this game would literally be I stand here and shoot till you die, and you stand there and shoot till I die. This type of battle usually results in whoever shot better first wins. Note that I said whoever shot better first and not who shot first, because whoever shot first could have missed everything, and then that could be capitalized on by the other army that then annihilates everything in 1 round of shooting. This is especially true in a game where each player takes turns, so if the person going first happens to get a great round of shooting off, it can almost win the game by itself. And this was the big problem we had in the beginning of 8th edition, before people realized you needed a bunch of terrain on the board. This also means close combat is pretty much cancelled out by the guns, because it's hard to run through an open field and not be gunned down. An example of this is, have you ever played a game like Call of Duty or Battlefield or Arma? In those games, you usually never want to run out into a big open spot because it just sets you up to be unloaded on by every angle. So instead, you take back alleys, ditches, ruins, and any other possible way to get to your destination that allows you to hide and not be shot at on your way there. This is where terrain comes in for Warhammer 40k. If you have enough terrain on the table, people can tactically move their units to either block line of sight or at least try to gain cover to take the least amount of casualties as possible. In one of my older videos, I covered a local tournament at my local gaming store, and I had one player who was upset that we were using the ITC rule, can't see through bottom level of ruins, because he couldn't sit still with his guard army and just blow stuff up. He lost the game because he didn't understand how to tactically move his tanks around the building or how to bait his opponent, and this led to his loss of the game, which he blamed on the terrain. Now let's say we didn't use the rule and he could just shoot through the terrain. Then he doesn't have to move at all, and he just shoots the enemy off the table for a victory, which, to be honest, doesn't really feel like a victory to me, at least in a tactical or strategical sense. He didn't have to think about what he was doing in order to win, he just had to shoot his guns. Winning a game should be based off of strategy, which includes unit deployment, how to decide on where to move your units, how to move your units, how many objectives you gain, and it should not be determined on who went first and brought bigger guns. And without proper terrain setup, you normally get the latter being your victory condition. So with all of that said, let me show you what I think is a properly balanced table for a competitive game of Warhammer 40k. First and foremost, you should have at least 1 or 2 giant line of sight blocking pieces of terrain right in the middle of the board. It doesn't have to be perfectly in the middle because sometimes you need to place an objective in the middle of the board for some ITC missions, so in this case you can slide it over just enough to be able to fit the objective. This problem is also easily solved by using 2 big pieces of terrain instead of 1, but if you're limited on your terrain, at least use 1 big line of sight blocking terrain in the middle of the board. Then each section of the board, which I should show now, should get at least 1 piece of terrain that also blocks line of sight and that has a perch or a ledge to place units on top of, or at least has a base that you can put units on so they can gain some sort of a save. There is no rule for this is just how I personally divide up a board. You want a terrain piece in each of these spots because depending on deployment, everyone will get some terrain or cover in their zone no matter which deployment they get, which keeps it fair. One of the worst things that can happen on a board is that through deployment, one player gets some terrain to hide while the other player has to deploy everything out in the open. To me, this just isn't fair at all. So instead, I like to make sure to have at least one piece of terrain in every section. I also try to mirror the types of terrain that I put into these sections. So for example, if the top left corner gets a tall ruin, then the bottom right corner should get a tall ruin that's about the same size. So again, if you get the corner deployments, it's equal and fair for both players. This does kind of take the advantage out of choosing your side, but I don't really feel it's fair to say just because you won one roll-off you get tons of terrain while the other guy gets shafted. So instead, I try to balance it as much as possible. So with that said, the minimum amount of terrain to use is 9 to 10 pieces of terrain. You need 1 or 2 big line of sight blocking pieces in the middle, and then 1 in each of the other 8 sections I showed. The terrain pieces in the middle should be at least or almost 1 foot in height, with being at least 8 to 12 inches wide. This is for line of sight blocking purposes, so if you don't like using the ITC rules where bottom level ruins aren't see-through, then find some terrain that does completely block line of sight. This can be mountainous terrain or just anything big enough to fully block line of sight. If you want to get intricate with it too, you can even board up windows on your ruins just to make sure that you actually can't see through them. Doing this requires players to tactically position themselves to do damage instead of just being able to stay still and shoot the opponent off the table. It also gives great places for melee units to run up the board and hide, so they have a chance of making it into combat. The rest of the terrain doesn't need to be as big, but should still be able to hide at least 1 to 2 units, or be big enough for 1 or 2 units to stand on and get cover at least. Also, all terrain you use should have a base or a ground floor, but doesn't necessarily need to, although I do think it helps. The terrain you see on my table doesn't all have bases, but in a perfect world, I should base them. Instead, I just use house rules and pretend that they have bases sticking out 1 inch in every direction. Terrain pieces to use are completely up to you, and I recommend getting ruins since they seem to work the best balance-wise. This is why when you see battle reports from Frontline Gaming, the owners of the ITC, they always have a lot of ruins on their board, more than any other type of terrain. This doesn't mean that you can't use trees or hills or anything else, just use more ruins than you do everything else. Probably at a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 ruins for every 1 other type of terrain used. Again, this is completely subjective and you can technically play with as much or as little terrain as you want, although it will change how the game is going to be played strategically. If there's less terrain, it's going to turn into a gunfight of I stand here, you stand there. If there's more terrain, then it's going to cause more tactical decisions on where to move units and what to shoot at, because you're not going to be able to shoot at everything with all this line of sight blocking terrain. I've found that for balance purposes for competitive events, these guidelines, in my opinion, are the best way to set up a board for a game that is balanced for every army. So that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys found it interesting and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have subscribed already but would like to help support the channel even more, you can do so on Patreon. The link is in the description. For a pledge of $4, you get access to the Almost Pro Gaming Patreon Discord server, where you can get help from either myself or other patrons when it comes to building lists or even just general advice. Well anyways, thanks for watching the video and I will see you guys in the next one. Happy wargaming!